Dawn broke over Velith Prime on the 5th day of the battle, and the light revealed a landscape transformed by war into something that would haunt the memories of everyone who survived. The Sketh forces were broken but not defeated, and Overlord Wrecked stood in his temporary command post with the taste of failure bitter on his tongue as he reviewed what remained of his once mighty invasion force. Half of his warriors were dead or wounded, and his supply lines had been obliterated by the suicidal human ships. And his carefully planned conquest had become a nightmare that grew worse with every passing hour. But he still had options. Prepare the orbital bombardment, he commanded with cold fury, replacing the confusion that had paralyzed him for days. If we cannot take the Corvani as slaves, we will take them as corpses. His officers moved to obey because they understood that their overlord had passed beyond reason into pure spite, and they knew that arguing with him would only result in their own deaths. The remaining Sketh warships began positioning themselves for a devastating strike on the planet below, and their weapon systems hummed with power as they prepared to turn Velith Prime into a graveyard. But Overlord Wrecked had forgotten something important in his rage. He had forgotten that Sergeant Major Park Jisoo never did anything without a reason. And he had forgotten that the humans had been buying time since the moment they arrived during the chaos of the ground battle. A small team led by Sergeant Cho Minho had infiltrated the primary Sketh command vessel using a captured shuttle and forged credentials stolen from dead officers. They had been aboard the ship for 18 hours, moving through maintenance corridors and avoiding patrols with the patient determination of predators stalking prey. Now they struck. Minho led his 8 soldiers onto the bridge of the Sketh flagship with weapons blazing and fury in their hearts. And they faced 200 Sketh crew members in a battle that should have been impossible. The Sketh had numbers and home, territory advantage, and venomous claws that could kill with a single scratch. The humans had something else entirely. They had spent 5 days watching their friends die for strangers, and they had absorbed enough rage and grief and determination to fuel a supernova. And they channeled all of that emotion into a focused assault that carved through the Sketh defenders like a blade through water. Minho took a claw across his chest and responded by grabbing the Sketh officer and using its own arm to stab 2 of its companions. Private Kwon Sujin ran out of ammunition and transitioned to her combat knife without hesitation, dancing between enemies with a grace that seemed impossible for someone who had been fighting for 5 days straight. One by one, the Sketh crew fell, and within minutes, the bridge belonged to 8 bleeding humans who stood among the bodies of their enemies with victory burning in their eyes. Sergeant Major, Minho transmitted with exhaustion and triumph blending in his voice. The flagship is ours. Park Jisoo received the message and felt a weight lift from her shoulders that had been crushing her since the moment she accepted this mission. Patch me through to the Sketh fleet, she ordered as she climbed to the highest point in the human defensive line. Every ship, every frequency, every soldier who can hear. The communication systems crackled as her transmission reached across the battle space to touch every Sketh ear and every Sketh mind. This is Sergeant Major Park Jisoo of the human mercenary company known as the Iron Wolves. She began with her voice steady and cold and absolutely certain. Velith Prime is under human protection, and any vessel that fires upon this world will be hunted. She paused to let the words sink in before continuing with the kind of threat that only humans could make sound genuine, not just destroyed. She clarified with ice in every syllable. Hunted. We will find your homeworlds, and we will remember your names. And we will come for you in the night when you think you are safe. This is not a threat, she concluded with absolute conviction. This is a promise. The Sketh fleet commanders listened to the human woman speak and tried to calculate the actual danger she represented. 200 soldiers could not threaten an Empire. A handful of civilian ships could not challenge a military fleet by any rational assessment. The humans were bluffing with an empty hand, but the Sketh had watched humans do the impossible for 5 days. They had watched humans charge into certain death with songs on their lips and smiles on their faces. They had watched humans sacrifice their own ships to protect strangers they had never met. They had watched humans refuse to surrender and refuse to retreat and refuse to behave like any sane species should behave when facing overwhelming odds, and they believed that these Deathworld creatures would spend years tracking down everyone responsible for Velith Prime. They believed that humans would cross the galaxy with vengeance burning in their hearts and patience that outlasted stars. They believed that sleeping safely in their beds would become impossible because humans never forgot and humans never forgave. And humans never ever stopped. The Sketh fleet withdrew not because the humans could destroy them, but because they were absolutely convinced that the humans would never stop trying. Overlord Vrecht screamed orders that no one obeyed as his captains engaged their faster-than-light drives and fled the system. And within an hour he found himself alone on a crippled command vessel, surrounded by humans who had every reason to kill him. Sergeant Minho stood over the defeated Overlord with a weapon pointed at his head and a choice to make that would define everything the Iron Wolves stood for. We should execute him, Private Sujin said with hatred burning in her eyes. For every Kovani he was going to enslave and every species he has already broken. Minho considered her words and felt the temptation of revenge pulling at his soul like gravity. Then he lowered his weapon. No, he said, with a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. We came here to protect the innocent, not to become the monsters we fight. He ordered Vrecht secured for transport to face trial before the Galactic Council, and the defeated Overlord was dragged from his own bridge by the creatures he had dismissed as fragile and weak. The battle for Velith Prime was over. 63 humans had survived out of the 200 who had dropped from the sky 5 days earlier, and they were carried through the streets of Korath by Corvani. Civilians who wept with gratitude and joy, children threw flowers at the armored soldiers who had become their protectors, and elders bowed their heads in respect to warriors who had proven that the galaxy still contained beings willing to stand against Tirannuna. Found Corporal B. Canuel teaching card games to a group of Corvani children, and his arm was in a sling, but his smile was brighter than the sun rising over their battered city. Will the Iron Wolves stay? She asked with hope she could not quite hide coloring her voice. Haniel looked up at her with warmth in his tired eyes, and shrugged with the casual ease of someone who had nothing left to prove. For a while, he said as he dealt another hand to his young students. Someone has to teach you how to bite back. Yuna sat down beside him and picked up the cards he offered her, and she felt something shift in her understanding of the universe. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the most advanced or the most numerous or the most anything by any objective measure, but they were the species that answered when the helpless called for help, and that made all the difference across the galaxy. 62 enslaved species watched recordings of the battle for Velith Prime with wonder and disbelief, flooding their captive minds. They watched humans bleeding and dying and never surrendering. They watched strangers become heroes for people they had never met. They watched a little refugee girl's faith in humanity validated by fire and steel and zero mercy in slave barracks on 100 worlds, in mining colonies and factory ships and breeding facilities where hope had died generations ago. Oppressed beings began to whisper a new word. They whispered it to each other in the darkness when their masters could not hear. They whispered it like a prayer and a promise and a prophecy of things to come. Hope, because if humans would cross the galaxy to save strangers, then maybe nobody was truly alone in the darkness anymore. Maybe someone would answer their call too, and somewhere on a human colony world. A 9-year-old girl named Somi watched the news broadcasts with tears streaming down her face and joy bursting in her chest. She had spent 6 years saving every credit she earned. She had spent 6 years believing that someone would help if she just asked loud enough. and 200 humans had answered her call with fire and steel and zero mercy. She was finally home. A Corvani elder named Tarek found Sergeant Major Park Jisoo in the medical tent as she patched a wound on her forearm with battlefield adhesive, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before finding the courage to speak. "I have watched your soldiers fight for 4 days," Tarek said with a voice that carried the weight of 70 years of peaceful existence. "And I have watched them die with smiles on their faces and songs on their lips." Park Jisoo finished sealing her wound and looked up at the elderly alien, with eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by anything anymore. "I must ask you a question that has been burning in my mind since you arrived," Tarek continued as he stepped closer with his 4 hands clasped together in the Corvani gesture of respect. "Do humans not fear death?" Park Jisoo considered the question carefully because it deserved a thoughtful answer, and she gestured for the elder to sit beside her on the medical cot. "We fear death," she said after a moment of silence. "We fear it very much because we love life and we want to experience as much of it as possible." She paused to check her weapon and ensure it was ready for the battle that would soon resume. "But we fear living as cowards more," she continued with absolute conviction ringing in every word. "We fear looking in the mirror and seeing someone who ran away when innocent people needed protection. And we fear dying in comfortable beds, knowing that we could have made a difference, but chose not to." Tarek absorbed her words with the slow deliberation of someone whose entire worldview was being restructured by a conversation. "Your species is very strange," he finally said with something approaching admiration in his tone. "We have been told that many times," Park Jisoo replied with a smile that softened the hard edges of her warrior's face. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of alarm sirens wailing across the city, and Park Jisoo was on her feet and moving before the first siren had finished its cycle. The Sketh final offensive had begun. 40,000 warriors surged toward the human defensive lines from every direction, and the weight of their numbers was so overwhelming that the ground itself seemed to shake beneath their marching feet. Overlord Vrecht had committed everything he had because he was tired of this resistance and tired of watching humans make fools of his officers and tired of a battle that should have ended in hours dragging on for days. He wanted these creatures dead, and he wanted the Corvani enslaved, and he wanted to move on to the next conquest without this shameful delay following his reputation. The humans fell back block by block as the Sketh tide crashed against their positions, and they made the invaders pay for every meter of advance with blood and screaming. Corporal Big Haniel found himself fighting beside Yuna as they retreated toward the central bunker complex, and he kept putting himself between the young Corvani and the incoming fire with a protective instinct that transcended species boundaries. "Stay close to me," he shouted over the chaos of battle. "We are going to get through this." Yuna wanted to believe him, but she could see the numbers, and she could count the remaining human soldiers, and she knew that mathematics did not lie. Then something happened that made her question everything she thought she knew about the universe. New contacts appeared on her communication equipment. At first, she thought the devices were malfunctioning because the signals were coming from orbit, and there should not have been any friendly vessels in the system. "Human signatures detected," she gasped as she checked the readings 3 times to make sure she was not hallucinating. 12 ships have just exited faster than light travel in high orbit." Haniel laughed with pure joy as he continued firing at the advancing Sketh forces. "I told you we would get through this," he said with a grin that made Yuna's heart skip a beat. "The cavalry has arrived, but the ships that appeared in the sky above Velith Prime were not military vessels with heavy weapons and trained crews. They were cargo haulers and mining ships and transport freighters, and even a luxury yacht that had been hastily retrofitted with weapons that looked like they had been bolted on by amateur Yuna stared at the sensor data with confusion flooding her features because these ships did not belong to any government or military organization. They were civilian vessels crewed by ordinary humans who had watched the battle unfold on galactic news networks and decided that they could not sit idle while their species fought alone. Miner from the asteroid belts had loaded his drilling charges onto external hardpoints and flown across 3 sectors to help a cargo captain had emptied her hold and filled it with volunteers who wanted to fight even though they had never held weapons before. A wealthy businessman had armed his pleasure yacht with whatever guns he could buy on short notice and pointed it toward the war. They were not soldiers. They were not trained. They were just humans who saw other humans dying for a righteous cause and refused to let them die alone. Overlord Vrecht watched these pathetic civilian ships enter his battle space and felt contempt rise in his throat because they posed no threat to his war fleet, and their presence changed nothing about the tactical situation. Then the human ships did something that made him choke on his contempt. Instead of engaging his fleet in a battle they could not win, the civilian vessels dove directly into the atmosphere of Veloth Prime with their engines burning at maximum power. They were not attacking his ships. They were using their own vessels as weapons against his ground forces. The first cargo hauler slammed into the primary Sketh staging area at orbital velocity, and the explosion vaporized 3,000 warriors and all of their equipment in a single instant. The mining ship hit the Sketh supply depot with enough force to create a crater that could be seen from space, and the drilling charges in its hold detonated in a cascade that turned the entire logistics hub into a lake of fire. One by one, the human ships sacrificed themselves to destroy the critical infrastructure that the Sketh invasion depended upon, and the crews ejected in escape pods moments before impact with the calm precision of people who had made peace with their choices. The yacht was the last to fall, and its owner had aimed it at Overlord Vrecht's personal command shuttle on the ground. With the kind of spite that only humans seemed capable of expressing, Vrecht barely escaped in time, and he watched his mobile headquarters explode from the window of an evacuation transport with rage and disbelief. Warring for control of his features, the human pilots who had survived their suicidal attacks were landing across the battlefield in their escape pods, and they were climbing out with rifles in their hands and joining the ground fight, as if crashing their ships into enemy positions was just the first part of their contribution. "They are insane," one of Vrecht's officers whispered with something approaching religious terror in his voice. "They destroyed their own ships, and they are still fighting." Vrecht said nothing because he was beginning to understand that he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the enemy he was facing. Humans did not fight like other species because they did not think like other species, and they did not value their own lives the way that rational creatures should. They valued something else more. They valued each other, and they valued the innocent, and they valued the idea that some things were worth dying for even when survival was still an option. Park Jisoo watched the sky burn with human sacrifice and felt tears streaming down her face beneath her helmet, and she opened a communication channel to the pilots who had just turned the tide of battle, iron wolves, to all arriving forces. She transmitted with emotion, cracking her usually steady voice. "Welcome to Veloth Prime, and thank you for answering the call." The response came from a dozen different voices speaking over each other with the chaotic enthusiasm of people who had just done something incredibly stupid and incredibly brave. "You did not think we would let you have all the fun, did you? The Sketh messed with the wrong species. Someone point me at the bad guys. I have got a rifle and a grudge." Park Jisoo laughed despite the tears and the exhaustion and the weight of everyone counting on her, and she began directing the new arrivals toward positions where they could do the most damage. The battle was not over yet, but for the first time since the Iron Wolves had landed on this world, Park Jisoo allowed herself to believe that they might actually win. 3 days had passed since the Iron Wolves dropped from the sky, and the city of Karath had become a fortress built from rubble and determination and the stubborn refusal of 200 humans to accept defeat. Young Yuna had abandoned her burning relay station and made her way to the human command post. And now she served as the unofficial communications coordinator for the Defense Force because her knowledge of local frequencies and emergency channels made her invaluable. She watched the human soldiers move through the defensive positions with a mixture of awe and confusion, because nothing about these creatures made sense to her Corvani understanding of warfare. They should have been exhausted after 72 hours of continuous combat. But they rotated shifts with mechanical precision and caught sleep in 15-minute intervals and kept fighting as if their bodies were machines rather than flesh. Corporal B. Caniel found Yuna staring at him during a quiet moment between Sketh assaults, and he smiled at her with a warmth that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "You are thinking too hard," he said, as he sat down beside her and pulled a ration pack from his belt. "I can see the gears turning in your head from across the room." Yuna blinked her large eyes and tried to form the question that had been haunting her since the humans arrived. "Why are you here?" she finally asked, with genuine bewilderment coloring her voice. "You did not know us before this battle, and you will not profit from our salvation, and many of you will die for people you have never met." Hanuel opened his ration pack and offered half of the compressed protein bar to Yuna, and she accepted it because she had learned that refusing human generosity was considered rude in their culture. "There was a girl named Somi who paid us to come," Hanuel said as he chewed his portion of the tasteless military food. "But that is not really why we are here." He paused to swallow before continuing with a thoughtful expression on his young face. "Humans come from a world that tried to kill us every day for 200,000 years. And we survived because we learned to protect each other against threats that should have wiped us out." Yuna listened intently as the human soldier spoke about his species with a casual honesty that she found both terrifying and beautiful. "We evolved on a planet with predators that could tear us apart and diseases that could kill millions and natural disasters that destroyed entire civilizations. And we survived all of it because we refused to abandon each other when things got hard." Hanuel finished his ration and crushed the packaging in his fist before tucking it into a pocket. "Someone has to stand between the innocent and the monsters," he said with a shrug that suggested this was the most obvious truth in the universe. "Might as well be us." Before Yuna could respond, an alarm blared through the command post, and soldiers began moving toward the eastern wall with weapons ready and faces grim. The Sketh had breached the outer perimeter. Sergeant Cho Minho led his squad toward the breach at a dead sprint, and he arrived to find a nightmare scenario unfolding as Sketh warriors poured through a collapsed section of the barricade. The aliens had concentrated their forces for a massive assault, and they had finally found a weak point in the human defenses. And now they were exploiting it with the brutal efficiency of experienced conquerors. "Hold the line," Minho shouted as he opened fire on the advancing horde. "Do not give them another centimeter." His soldiers formed up around him and created a wall of flesh and steel that the Sketh crashed against like waves against a cliff. And for several minutes, the humans held through sheer force of will and accuracy of fire. Then the ammunition began to run low. Then the wounded began to outnumber the healthy. Then Minho realized that his squad was cut off from the rest of the defensive line with no route of retreat and no hope of reinforcement. Standard military doctrine was clear about situations like this, and every tactical manual in the galaxy agreed that the correct response was to fall back and preserve forces for future engagements. Sergeant Major Park Jisoo had never been particularly good at following standard military doctrine. "All available units converge on the eastern breach," she commanded through the communication network. "We are not leaving anyone behind." The response from her soldiers was immediate and overwhelming as humans abandoned their defensive positions and charged toward the sound of fighting with a reckless abandon that made the Kovani observers gasp in horror. They should have been protecting the civilians. They should have been maintaining their carefully constructed defensive perimeter. They should have been doing anything other than throwing themselves into a hopeless battle to rescue soldiers who were probably already dead. But humans did not think like other species, and they did not calculate the value of individual lives against strategic objectives. And they absolutely refused to accept that some people were expendable. Private Quan Sujin was the first to reach the breach, and she crashed into the Sketh, flanked like a one-woman apocalypse with her rifle blazing and her wounded shoulder completely ignored. "Minho!" She screamed over the chaos of battle. "Get your people moving! We are punching a hole!" More humans followed her into the breach, and they fought with a ferocity that transcended training or discipline or even survival instinct. They fought like people who would rather die together than live, knowing they had abandoned their comrades. The Sketh had never seen anything like it. Overlord Vrecht watched the battle unfold from his command ship with growing frustration because his warriors should have been able to exploit the breach and collapse the entire human defensive line. Instead, his forces were being ground down by humans who refused to retreat and refused to surrender and refused to behave like any rational species should behave. When facing overwhelming odds, they are losing soldiers they cannot afford to lose. One of his advisors pointed out with confusion evident in his voice, "This counterattack makes no tactical sense." Rex said nothing because he was beginning to understand something terrible about the creatures he was fighting. Humans did not measure victory in territory gained, or enemies killed, or resources captured. They measured victory in brothers and sisters saved. And they would burn the entire galaxy to ash before they would leave one of their own behind. The counterattack succeeded despite the odds, and Minho's squad was pulled from the breach with only 3 casualties instead of the complete annihilation that should have occurred. 11 humans died in the rescue attempt. 11 soldiers who could have survived if their commanders had accepted the loss and maintained the defensive line. Park Jisoo stood over the bodies of the fallen and felt the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders like a physical burden. And she knew that some species would call her decision foolish or wasteful or strategically unsound. But when she looked at the soldiers she had saved, and when she saw the tears on the faces of warriors who had been ready to die alone, she knew that she had made the right choice. Get them to medical, she ordered as she turned away from the dead and focused on the living. And someone tell me how the Sketh found that weak point in our line. Yuna approached with a datapad clutched in her trembling hands, and she showed Park Jisoo a map of Sketh force deployments that made the sergeant major's blood run cold. They are massing their reserves, Yuna said with fear making her voice shake. 40,000 warriors are preparing for a final assault, and they will hit us from every direction at once. Park Jisoo studied the map and saw the death of everyone she was trying to protect written in the enemy positions. 189 humans against 40,000. Sketh. Math was impossible, but Park Jisoo had been buying time since the moment she landed on this world, and she had been waiting for the Sketh to concentrate their forces in exactly this way. Good, she said with a smile that made Yuna wonder if humans were capable of fear at all. Now we just need to hold out a little longer. Yuna stared at the human commander with disbelief flooding her features, because the situation was hopeless, and everyone knew it was hopeless. And yet, this woman was smiling. What could possibly save us now? Yuna demanded. Park Jisoo looked up at the sky where stars were beginning to appear in the darkening purple atmosphere of Velith Prime. The rest of humanity has been watching this battle for 3 days, she said with quiet confidence. And if I know my species, they will not let us fight alone much longer. Overlord Vrecht stood on the command bridge of his flagship and watched the tactical display with 4 eyes that had witnessed the fall of 17 worlds during his long career as a conqueror. A single human vessel had entered orbit above Velith Prime, and his officers were waiting for orders with the nervous energy of predators who sensed that something unusual was happening. Wreck made a sound that passed for laughter among the Sketh, and his armored scales rippled with amusement as he studied the tiny ship that dared to challenge his invasion fleet, one vessel. He said to his second-in-command with contempt dripping from every syllable, "The humans send one vessel against 40,000 of my warriors." He had studied humans extensively before this campaign, because the Sketh hegemony always researched potential threats. And he knew everything worth knowing about the strange creatures from the heavy gravity world. Called Earth humans were fragile despite their dense bones and thick muscles, and they lacked the natural armor that protected Sketh warriors from harm. And their venomous bodies made them weak in close combat compared to species that had evolved proper weapons. They were dangerous in the way that cornered animals were dangerous. But they were still just animals in the end. Activate the anti-air batteries, Wrecked commanded with a dismissive wave of his clawed hand. Swat that ship from the sky and let us return to the harvest. The weapons officers obeyed instantly, and targeting systems locked. Onto the human vessel as it descended toward the planet with what appeared to be suicidal determination then. The ship did something that made Wreck pause with confusion, spreading across his scarred face instead of attempting evasive maneuvers or retreating to a safe distance. The human vessel opened its cargo bays and released 200 objects that fell toward the planet like a swarm of burning meteors. The objects were too small for the anti-air batteries to track effectively, and they moved too fast for the targeting computers to establish reliable firing solutions. And they scattered across such a wide area that concentrated fire was impossible. What am I looking at? Wreck demanded as his officers scrambled to analyze the falling objects. Drop pods. One of his tactical advisors answered with disbelief evident in his voice. The humans are using orbital insertion pods to bypass our air defenses. Wreck stared at the display as 200 humans plummeted through the atmosphere in metal coffins that offered no room for error and no possibility of course correction and no chance of survival if anything went wrong. No sane species use such primitive and dangerous deployment methods when safer alternatives existed, but humans were not sane by any civilized standard. The drop pod slammed into the surface of Velith Prime like fists from an angry god, and they punched through buildings and cratered streets and buried themselves in the soft agricultural soil of a world that had never known War Sergeant Cho Minho felt the impact rattle his bones as his pod came to rest in the middle of a Sketh staging area, and he did not wait for his body to recover from the brutal landing before he kicked open the hatch and emerged with his rifle, already firing. The Sketh soldiers around him froze for a critical half-second because they expected the human to be disoriented and injured and easy prey after such a violent arrival. They learned their mistake when Minho put 3 rounds through the nearest warrior before his boots had fully touched the ground. Private Quan Sujin landed 50 meters away and immediately found herself surrounded by 5 Sketh soldiers who towered over her small frame with venomous claws extended and armored bodies positioned for the kill. She shot 2 of them before they could react, and when the third one drove its poisonous claw through her shoulder, she responded by slamming her helmeted forehead into its face with enough force to crack its orbital plates. The Sketh crumpled to the ground unconscious, and Sujin pulled the claw from her shoulder with a grunt of pain before turning to face the remaining 2 enemies, with blood running down her arm and murder shining in her eyes. "Is that all you have?" she shouted as she raised her rifle one-handed and fired, until both aliens stopped moving across the staging area. The Iron Wolves carved through the Sketh forces with a brutality that defied every tactical projection, and within minutes, the organized military position had become a chaotic slaughterhouse overlord. Wrecked watched the helmet camera footage from his ground forces with growing unease as human after human emerged from their drop pods and immediately began killing with an efficiency that bordered on mechanical. One soldier took a blade through his leg and responded by grabbing his attacker and using it as a shield while he shot. 3 other Sketh warriors. Another soldier ran out of ammunition and transitioned to hand-to-hand combat without hesitation, breaking necks and crushing throats with hands that should not have been strong enough to damage Sketh armor. 3rd soldier caught fire from an incendiary weapon and continued fighting for another 30 seconds before her squadmates extinguished the flames, and she was back on her feet and shooting within a minute of being literally set ablaze. "What are these creatures?" one of Wrecked's officers whispered with something like fear. Entering his voice, Wrecked did not answer, because he was watching a specific piece of footage that had frozen his blood in a way that nothing had managed to do in decades of war for a human. Soldier was dragging 2 wounded Corvani civilians through a combat zone while laying down suppressive fire with one hand and pulling the injured aliens with the other. And his body was already bleeding from multiple wounds that should have incapacitated him, but the detail that made Wreck's scales rise with instinctive terror was the sound coming from the soldier's helmet speakers. The human was singing, he was bleeding, and surrounded by enemies and probably dying. And he was singing some cheerful melody from his homeworld, as if the chaos around him was nothing more than an inconvenience. Vect had conquered species that fought back with desperate courage, and he had broken worlds defended by warriors who would rather die than surrender. But he had never encountered creatures that approached slaughter with such casual joy. Increase the pressure on all fronts, he ordered with a growl that hid his growing concern. "I want every human dead before nightfall." His officers rushed to obey, but Wreck could see the doubt spreading through his command staff like a disease. The Sketh were apex predators who had ruled their homeworld through violence and cunning for 100,000 years, and they had never encountered a species that charged toward danger instead of fleeing from it. Humans did not behave like prey, and they did not behave like normal predators either. They behaved like something far worse. They behaved like creatures who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. And they fought with the absolute conviction of beings who had decided that death was preferable to failure. Down on the surface of Velith Prime, Sergeant Major Park Jisoo rallied her scattered forces and began the long process of establishing a defensive perimeter around the capital city. 300,000 Corvani civilians were counting on 200 humans to protect them from an army that outnumbered them by factors that made the math meaningless. But Park Jisoo had never been particularly good at math. She was much better at war. First squad, secure the eastern approach. She barked into her communication system as she directed her soldiers with the calm precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. Second squad, set up overlapping fields of fire on the northern bridge. And third squad, I want those civilians evacuated to the central bunker complex within the hour. Her soldiers moved to obey with the fluid efficiency of a unit that trusted each other completely. And the Sketh forces that tried to pursue them discovered that chasing humans was significantly more dangerous than fighting them head-on, because humans set traps, they used the terrain against their enemies, and they turned every building into a fortress and every street into a killing ground. And they made the Sketh pay for every meter of advance in blood and screaming as the sun set on the first day of the battle for Velith Prime. Overlord Wrecked reviewed the casualty reports and felt something cold settle in his chest. He had lost 3,000 warriors to 200 humans, and the humans were still singing. The relay station was burning when Yuna finally reached the communication console, and smoke filled her lungs as she crawled across the cracked floor toward the only working terminal in the entire building. Her Four-fingered hands trembled as she activated the emergency broadcast system, and tears streamed down her pale blue face because she already knew the truth that everyone on Velith Prime had accepted hours ago. No one was coming to save them. The Galactic Council had declared their world a lost cause 3 days earlier, and the official statement had used words like strategic, withdrawal, and resource allocation priorities. But everyone understood what those phrases actually meant to Corvani. People of Velith Prime were not worth Savin, punched in the universal distress frequency, and began speaking into the microphone with a voice that cracked from exhaustion and despair. And she described the Sketh landing, ships that darkened the sky like a plague of metal, locusts descending upon her peaceful agricultural world. She talked about the screaming and the fires and the families being dragged from their homes by armored slavers who saw her. People is nothing more than merchandise, to be sold across 3 sectors of space. She begged for anyone to hear her, anyone at all, even though she knew that begging had never stopped the Sketh hegemony from taking what they wanted. The Sketh had conquered 63 species across the galaxy, and they had perfected the art of breaking worlds. And Velith Prime was simply the next name on their list of conquests. Una finished her broadcast and slumped against the console as the building groaned around her. And she waited for the ceiling to collapse, or the Sketh to find her, or simply for the silence to swallow her whole. Then the console crackled with static and a voice cut through. The noise like a blade through fabric. Velith Prime. This is Sergeant Major Park Jisoo of the Iron Wolves, the voice said. And it carried an accent that Una had only heard once before in her life when human traders had passed through her system years ago. Hold position, the human woman continued. And her tone was calm and steady, as if she were discussing weather patterns instead of an impossible rescue mission. We are already en route. Una stared at the console and wondered if the smoke inhalation had damaged her brain, because she could not possibly have heard those words. Correctly, humans were mercenaries who charged prices that small colonies could never afford, and the Corvani government had considered hiring them months ago, but rejected the idea because humans were deemed too expensive and too violent, and too unpredictable for civilized warfare. No one had hired the humans. No one could have afforded them. I do not understand. Una transmitted back with confusion flooding her voice. We never sent a contract request to any human company, and we do not have the resources to pay for military intervention. The communication line went quiet for a moment, and when Sergeant Major Park spoke again, there was something almost gentle beneath her iron tone. 3 years ago, human traders found a Corvani refugee child drifting in an escape pod near the Vareth Nebula, Park said. Her name was Somi, and she was 7 years old, and she had watched slavers destroy her transport ship and kill her parents. Una felt her heart begin to pound faster as she listened to the human commander speak. The traders brought her to a human colony world where she grew up safe and fed and loved by people who owed her nothing. Park continued. She worked in a factory and saved every credit she earned for 6 years. And last month she walked into our headquarters and placed her entire life savings on my desk. The sergeant major paused before delivering the words that made Una's breath catch in her throat. She hired us to protect her homeworld, and she asked us to make sure that no other Corvani child would ever watch their parents die the way she did. Una could not speak because her throat had closed with emotion, and she thought about a little girl she had never met, who had carried the memory of her lost world across the stars and refused to let that world burn without a fight. How many soldiers do you have? Una finally managed to ask. 200, the number hit Una like a physical blow because the Sketh had landed 40,000 warriors on Velith Prime, and 200 soldiers against that army was not a rescue mission, but a mass suicide. That is not enough. Yuna said with desperation creeping into her voice. The Sketh have overwhelming numbers and heavy armor and orbital support. And 200 soldiers cannot possibly. We are humans, Park Jisoo interrupted. And her voice carried absolute certainty that defied all logic and reason. 200 of us is more than enough. The transmission ended, and Yuna sat alone in the burning relay station trying to understand what kind of creatures would fly across the galaxy to die for strangers because a refugee child had asked them to. She did not have to wait long for her answer aboard the drop carrier Defiant Purpose. Sergeant Major Park Jisoo stood before her assembled soldiers in the cargo bay and looked at the faces of men and women who had followed her into impossible battles across a dozen worlds. They were scarred and tired and armed with weapons that most species considered barbaric. And they listened as she explained the mission parameters with brutal honesty. The Sketh outnumber us 200 to 1, Park said as she paced before the ranks of armored soldiers. They have air superiority and heavy vehicle support, and enough troops to bury us in bodies if they choose to. She stopped pacing and met the eyes of her people, one by one. The Galactic Council has written off Velith Prime as a lost cause, and no reinforcements are coming. And every tactical assessment says that this mission is suicide. The cargo bay remained silent as the Iron Wolves absorbed the information without flinching. And not a single soldier looked away from there. Commander, I am asking you to drop into hell for people you have never met because a 9-year-old girl believed that we were the kind of humans who would answer when the helpless called for help. Park Jisoo let those words hang in the recycled air of the ship before she asked the question that she already knew the answer to. Anyone who wants to stay on the ship can do so without shame, and I will not judge you for choosing survival over sacrifice. No one moved, no one even breathed loudly. Corporal Beak Haniel was the first to break the silence with a grin spreading across his young face despite the gravity of the moment. Sergeant Major, with respect, you know damn well that none of us joined the Iron Wolves because we wanted to live forever. Laughter rippled through the ranks, and soldiers began checking their weapons and adjusting their drop pod harnesses with the casual efficiency of people who had made peace with death long ago. Sergeant Cho Min-ho stepped forward and slammed his fist against his chest, played in the traditional salute of the Iron Wolves. We go where we are needed, he said, with pride ringing in every word. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves, and we do not leave anyone behind. The rest of the company echoed his words until the cargo bay thundered with the sound of 200 voices, speaking as one. Park Jisoo felt something warm bloom in her chest as she watched her soldiers prepare to die for strangers on a world they had never seen. And she understood in that moment why humanity had earned such a fearsome reputation across the galaxy. It was not because humans were the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically advanced species in known space. It was because humans were the only species crazy enough to believe that some things were worth dying for, even when survival was still an option. Good, Park Jisoo said as she pulled on her own helmet and sealed it with a sharp click. Let us teach these slavers what a Deathworld breeds.